So we're going to talk about Isaac Newton. There's only a couple things I want you to know when we finish this, and that is, what were some of Newton's discoveries during his miracle year? What was Newton's dispute with Leibniz? And whose notation do we use for calculus? So let's start. I'm going to start with a quote from Edmund Halley. We'll see him later. It says, "Join me in singing the praises of Newton, who reveals all of this. No closer to the gods can any mortal rise." Wow, it's just really high praise. This was said in eulogy. Newton was born on Christmas Day in Woolsthorpe, England. You can see this page from his diary. Newton was a fan of Google Maps. In that sense, he was ahead of his time. So he lived about, 2 1/3 hours north of London, in a little town called Woolsthorpe. We'll have the chance to look at this photo later in the course because this is Newton's childhood home. But what I find ironic is that there's these symbols here that kind of look like what we use in calculus, symbol for integration. But that wasn't Leibniz, or that wasn't Newton's notation. So it's kind of funny that they're there, and I don't know why they're there architecturally. In his early childhood, his father died before he was born. So his mother married a pastor who was fairly wealthy named Barnabas Smith. Barnabas wasn't really interested in somebody else's child, so Newton was raised by his maternal grandmother. Meanwhile, Barnabas went on to father 3 more kids with Isaac's mother, despite the fact that he was 70 years old. So apparently he wasn't concerned about their long-term well-being. When he died, Newton moved back home with his mother, and then eventually went to school in his early years at Grantham. There's a lot of cool stories from when he was younger. I'm not going to take the time to go through all of them. One of them that was particularly interesting, though, was he got in a fight with the schoolmaster's son. And even though Newton was a smaller kid, he really cleaned up the floor with him. He really beat the snot out of him. And after he was done, he dragged him over to the wall of the school and rubbed his nose in the wall. And then it wasn't enough just to beat him up physically. He had to become an intellectual star, and he beat him up academically as well. And that was kind of like an early indication of some of Newton's prowess intellectually. I'm going to fast forward to his years in college. He got accepted at Trinity College, and even though his mom had a lot of money and could have paid for it, she didn't. She didn't want him to go to college. She wanted him to be a farmer like the rest of the family. And that experiment lasted about 9 months. And when Newton kept on going out to the tree outside his house and ignoring his pigs raiding his neighbor's farms, Newton's mom said, "Fine, you go, except you have to pay for it." So he did by being what's called a sizer. And a sizer really meant you were earning your way through college. It was the lowest of the low as far as status at Trinity. And that meant you had to clean up plates after dinner. You had to change people's chamber pots. It was really kind of, So kind of rough going for Newton at college. But in the year 1665 and 1666, Cambridge University was closed down because of a plague. So Newton went back to Woolsthorpe, and that was his miracle year. And I love this picture because it summarizes so much of what he did during that year. Does anyone recognize the object in his hands right here? What is that? That's refracting light into different colors.
Prism.
It's a prism, yeah. And Newton formulated his early theories about light. Now, back then, people thought that white light was something that traveled in waves. And Newton thought of it as having a corpuscular or particle formation. We know now, we've known since the early 1900s, that white light has both properties. It travels as a wave and it has particle properties. But this was a revolutionary theory back in the 1660s. You also see the sun and planets going around in a particular orbital path. That orbital path is an ellipse. Newton proved that. That's part of his theories of gravities. And of course, there's this story about Newton being underneath an apple tree and the apple hitting him, and he came up with his theory of gravity. That's probably apocryphal, but whatever. This is his telescope. He created this telescope to better study the sun and the stars, and it was a revolutionary telescope. When he showed this to the Royal Society, who was the big kind of research institution at the time, it was a huge hit. Over here, you see something I'll talk about, one of the books he wrote in the 1880s. And then, of course, over his shoulder, you see the tides. So it just summarizes so much. Now, in this year of 1665, 1666, when Cambridge was closed down due to the plague, he discovered all these theories and laid the groundwork for calculus. He formulated his 3 early laws of motion, came up with a binomial series for non-integer values, and laid the foundations for calculus. I mean, it was just incredible. This guy was like 22, 23 years old at the time, at home alone, and he's making all these discoveries. It's just amazing. You know, that's why they call it his annus mirabilis, his miracle year. That's literally what it was. There's seldom been such a creative outburst in all of human history. The only other one that would rival that would be 1905 with Albert Einstein, his annus mirabilis. So here's just, you know, kind of a quick idea of things you do with and without calculus. We looked at some of those earlier today. We looked at the slope of a line. That gave you the average rate of change of a line. But with calculus, you can get the instantaneous rate of change. You can find the area for various geometric objects. With calculus, you can find the area underneath the curve for any curve, and on and on. Against the odds, he was elected a fellow at Trinity College. This just didn't happen to sizers. They were the lowest of the low. But effectively, this made him a graduate student and allowed him to continue his studies. And at age 29, he became department chair of math. Wow. Everything was rolling right for Isaac Newton. He was a strange bird. He definitely was a strange bird. Now, if you got a weak stomach, maybe you want to turn down the volume for a second. But this shows one of his experiments with lights, actually a couple of experiments with lights, and particularly one on the right shows him rubbing a bodkin, which is kind of like a sewing needle, behind the back of his eyeball and moving it around just to see what happens. This is literally a copy out of his notes. He would wake up in the morning and be struck with such an onrush of thoughts that he wouldn't get out of bed. His cat Melchior grew fat with all Newton's meals that he didn't eat because he was still thinking about things in his bedroom. That telescope that I mentioned earlier, he showed it to the Royal Society and they loved it. They made him a member instantly. And then he wrote him a paper about his theories of light, and it didn't sit well. Now, Newton had been thinking about this stuff for a while, but other people, in particular Robert Hooke, thought that he was wrong, and it led to controversy. And this really set the tone for Isaac Newton in later life. He's like, that's it. I am done publishing because, you know, I have to deal with all these controversies, you know, raised against me by ignoramuses. He didn't like it, so he just stopped sharing his ideas. And that's the way it was with Newton for a couple decades, until this famous power launch that includes Robert Hooke and Edmund Halley. Now, you know Halley from Halley's Comet fame, even though he was an amazing guy in and of himself. He was a sea captain, a cartographer, geometer at Oxford University, discovered a lot of things. What he didn't discover was Halley's Comet. He just noticed that it seemed to be returning every 76 or so years. So anyways, they're having this power lunch, and the boastful Robert Hooke says, you know what? I want you to figure out what the orbit of the planets would be under something called the inverse square law. And Halley became obsessed with this. And he went and called on Isaac Newton, says, hey, Newton, what would this be? And Newton says, well, the ellipse. And Halley was struck that Newton knew this immediately. And Halley's like, well, can you show me? And Newton couldn't find it in his papers. So this is like finding a cure for COVID and forgetting where you put the recipe. And Halley's like, no, you got to do this for me. So Newton retired for 2 years of scribbling and produced his masterwork. It was the Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica. And this was a beacon to those who could follow. And not everyone could follow because he made it intentionally difficult. He didn't want to deal with mathematical amateurs or mathematical smatterers, as he called them, but explained so much about the motion of the tides, trajectory of a cannonball. It was a beacon for those who could follow. And one of the people that kind of followed, was very interested in him, was John Locke, who became friends with Isaac Newton. And a lot of his philosophies, which directly influenced the Constitution, come from his association with Isaac Newton. So a lot of our Constitution is in its way influenced through the work of Isaac Newton. And you talk to Mike Volbach, our history professor, a little bit more about John Locke. Newton worked at the Royal Mint for a while, and he was the head of the Royal Mint. So about a third of his productive life, he was working at the Royal Mint, and he still found time to do so much else. He was big in combating counterfeit money, which was a huge problem at the time. I don't have time to explain exactly why, but look at all this stuff that he did. We're working at the Royal Mint. He applied that same scientific rigor to working at the Royal Mint that he did in his research into calculus. He had 500 men working for him, 50 horses. He increased their output from 15,000 pounds a week to 100,000 pounds a week. It's just amazing. When Newton published his book Principia and calculus became better known, he ran into foul with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who discovered calculus later than Newton, but independent of Newton. And Newton hadn't published, so there became this calculus dispute. Now, ironically, we actually use Leibniz notation for calculus. It's a better notation than Newton's. Newton's was awful. I'm glad we don't use his notation. Later in life, he was, let's see, he was a bachelor all his life. And when he worked at the Royal Mint, because there was so much problems with counterfeiters and counterfeit coins, he became Justice of the Peace in 7 counties of England and was responsible for sending 80 men to the gallows because they were counterfeiting or clipping coins. The reason we have edges on our quarters goes back to Isaac Newton. It's because once you have those edges, it becomes very obvious if somebody files those down. So the edges on a quarter and dimes, those go back to Isaac Newton. He was a member of Parliament for 2 years, and his only recorded utterance was saying, "Could someone please shut the window?" There's a draft. So, trying to race through things here. Even though he worked at he was in the College of Trinity at Cambridge, he had heretical religious pursuits. He didn't believe in the Trinity and believed in something called Arianism. I'm not going to talk much about that, but his position was a little bit at odds with his religious beliefs, and he spent a lot of time in his religious beliefs. He taught himself Hebrew so he could read original text. He was a brilliant man. Brilliant. Not sure I'd party with him all the time, but he's a brilliant man. Sources of Newton's genius, it's hard to say. The rest of his family tree doesn't really shine other than one niece. Can't remember her last name, but her last name was Conduit by marriage. But a couple insights. One of the things he said is when he was asked how he came up with his theory of gravity, he says, by thinking on it continually. And Newton and Einstein both had this capacity to think on problems for a long period of time and just really penetrate that with their thought. And then this modest statement, if I have seen a little farther than those who have come before me, it's because I stood on the shoulders of giants. And those would include Kepler, Galileo, Boyle, Descartes, who really laid the groundwork for Newton to accomplish all he did. So, brilliant man, brilliant man. Okay, any comments, thoughts, or questions? Anything you found interesting? If you want to do some of your own reading, this book here in the middle, Never at Rest, is the book to read about Isaac Newton. It's really difficult. You can find some other stuff on Isaac Newton in Bill Bryson's book, Short History of Nearly Everything. This is a fictional version of a portion of Newton's life, which is excellent, excellent reading. And then I haven't read the one on the left, but the one on the right is a nice low-level way to get into Newton. It's more about his career at the Royal Mint, but it's, again, a good way to get to know some Isaac Newton without going through the nearly impenetrable Richard Westphal tome. So, okay. Thank you so much.